Okay, so hey guys, my name is Nuwan, and I am a software engineer at Google. So I'll give another few seconds for people to join, and then I'll start my session in like 30 seconds time. Okay, so as I said before, I am a software engineer at Google, and I work in a group called NBU, which stands for Next Billion Users. So at Google, for everything, we have a three-letter acronym. Even three-letter acronyms are called TLS for some weird reason. So I will get into the details about what NBU and what NBU is and what we do later on the live Q&A. So for the timing, let me explain like what my plan is for tonight session. So I will first of all introduce like how I got to Google, and then I will talk about some of the changes I saw working in Google compared to what I've seen in the industry, and then I will talk about what we do as the NBU group and what it means for people, and what are the learnings I've gotten about building for the emerging markets. So talking about myself, I graduated from University of Moratuwa from the computer science department in year 2010. So it has been around 6.5 years now in the industry, of which the last 1 year I was with Google. But before that, I initially worked in a couple of places before that. So, but before I joined university, I used to compete in something called the International Olympiad in Informatics, as well as SEM ICPZ, which is the university equivalent of IOI. So I used to start coding before I joined university, and from around grade 9 or grade 10. I think there is coincidentally a lot of the Googlers who are from Sri Lanka are alumni of IOI team or the ACM ICPC, which I think is more of a coincidence in the sense that you don't have to have done competitive programming to go to Google. But coincidentally, most of the Sri Lankans who are engineers at Google tend to be from that. So how I got to here is basically when I was in my final year of graduation, I applied for Google, and it was in the final year, and it didn't obviously work out. So what happened was in Google, how it works is you first have the CV filtering, and then you have the HR going through your CV, and then you go through an online interview or a couple of online interviews. And if they see fit, then they invite you to the on-site interviews. So by the time I went to on-sites, but didn't go beyond that. But in fact, it wasn't And it wasn't until 5 years later that I actually joined Google, which was on my third attempt joining Google. So, but what I found out after I joined Google was that it's actually a very common thing in here that people do not get in the first time. And in fact, more than 50% of the Googlers would actually have interviewed a few times. So one advice is, like, if you try once and it doesn't work out, it does not necessarily mean that you don't fit well. It means that it means that you could improve a little bit, and or they couldn't have gotten enough signals to proceed with it. So don't take it as a negative point. And the other thing is, when I talk about joining Google, a lot of the times people say, like, they don't feel like they fit into the Google level, and I think that's a complete misunderstanding. And and plus, the other thing is, a lot of the times people would say, like, why would you try to do something like this? And what I think is, like, people would judge you by what you have done, and you will be judging yourself by what you're going to do. And there's always going to be that slight difference between those two things. So you should manage what people would assume of you doing. So that's about how I got into Google. So next I talk about, I worked with a couple of places before. I worked in Virtusa for around 3 years, right after I graduated from university. And then over here I came to Singapore to do my master's in the US. And so after my master's finished, I started a startup of my own over here. And around that time, I got a request from Google, which worked out this time. So the first thing that I found out that was really interesting about Google was that in Google, almost all of code is open. And that actually surprised me, as well as a lot of the people who joined with me, because the assumption was that Google has a lot of intellectual property, so it would be crazy to have 30,000 odd engineers looking at this code, like, without any boundaries. And so at Google, how it works is, you can look into code like Google Search or Gmail or Maps, or how they work, and not only just view, but we can actually contribute to the code. So the obvious next question is, like, if there's 30,000 engineers looking at the Google code, and who can write code into that, how does the Google landing page not mess up? So the reason is because there's a really nice process in how the code goes into the Google code base. And so I think that is one thing that is really interesting about Google, is that they maintain a very open culture, but at the same time they have the right process in place to make sure that nothing is really messed up. So by the way, and if you have any questions, just post a comment, and I will, if it fits in the flow, I will answer immediately, or if not, I'll answer in the Q&A session. So going into how the Google front page or the Google search engine does not get messed up, even though everyone in Google can write code into the repository, it's because every single line in Google that goes into the code base is actually peer reviewed. And how it works is that there's a tool called Critique into which we submit something called a change list, and this gets, so then we will appoint a few peers to look into it, and there's a system into which people can log in and then suggest ideas and basically have a conversation around the entire change list. For instance, when I say code reviews, people would imagine, like, it's like a bunch of TLs would get together into a room, and then they will discuss what an engineer did over a last month's period, which is very inefficient. And so the idea is that you have to have the processes built into the system and have the right technology and the technical tools to enable those processes. So how it works is, so you submit the code, and then you have to get the approval from the owners of the portion that you submitted the code to. So basically, you can think of the entire Google the code base as one single folder, inside which you have subfolders for search, subfolder for maps, and so on. And each of those, down to the granularity of a single file, each portion will have an owner or a bunch of owners. And while you can submit code to any portion of the Google folder structure, you have to get the approval of those owners, as well as something called readability, which is basically a test into whether the Java or whatever this language that you're following, the styles are met. So, and plus there's a whole bunch of automated tools that run and ensure that the code is maintaining good quality. So that really helps in having that open code, but still being able to ensure that whoever that codes into it adheres to the Google's level of coding. And the second thing was that there's a lot of freedom at Google when it comes to working. For instance, there's no office timing, and that is something really interesting for me, because anybody who knows me knows that I tend to not work in time. So, for instance, when I was in Virtus, I remember that I once came very early to the office, and the security guard who was in charge at that time thought he was doing the wrong shift, because in his mind it was like, if he sees me at this time, he should be out of the office because he's doing the wrong shift. So, but at Google, there's a lot of people who would turn up at 11 p.m. or 12 p.m. or even 1 or 2, it goes up to even 5 p.m. And you can leave the office around from 2 to 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, whatever it is. The idea is that it doesn't really matter like what time you come to work and what time you go out of office, because you can work from anywhere. And the important thing is you just get great work done. And again, another thing is, even if you look at clothing, Google has a rule that there's no dress code. And in fact, in the letter that you get once you get selected to Google, and you get an invitation letter for the first day of your work, and they say that you can wear whatever you want, because we believe that what you want does not really impact how you work or what sort of work you produce. And that is something really interesting that I found in Google. And so you can find people who will be wearing like shorts and slippers or sandals and coming to work. And that really helps, because how you work or what you wear to work or when you decide to work does not really matter. And it only matters that you produce great work. And the third thing is that at Google, engineering goes as a separate career path of its own. And what I mean by this is that engineering is not a means to an end, but an end of its own. For instance, if you look at if you ask a fresh graduate, what do you see yourself doing in 10 years time? He would say, like, in 10 years time, I don't want to be coding, and I want to be like managing people. And that's what exactly happens in Sri Lanka. For instance, in a lot of the places, you would be joining as an engineer. In 1 year, you'll be a senior engineer, and then you'll be a tech lead, and at that point, you'll be starting to manage people's leaves and basically get into people management tasks. And that really does not help if your company is going to build extremely smart technology, because, and this does not happen in any other field. For instance, you don't hear a doctor going, saying, in 10 years time, I don't want to be checking patients and prescribing medicine. They just become better doctors and they become consultants or specialists. But in software engineering, people would look at it like an entry into going into management or something else. So I think if that's the wrong mentality, if you in getting into software engineering, I think if you really love coding or be doing software engineering, that shouldn't be the mentality. And at Google, this is reflected in the career. So how it goes is, in engineering, you enter as an L3 engineer, and then you go into L4. L5 is senior engineer, and then you go into staff engineer, senior staff engineer, principal engineer, distinguished engineer, and then Google Fellow. At Google Fellow level, it's basically equivalent to a vice president if you talk in cross-functional terms. And then you have senior Google Fellow, which is a senior vice president equivalent. And the cool thing is, there are senior Google Fellows who are coding on a daily basis. So basically, there's senior vice presidents who will be submitting code, not occasionally, but actually in daily basis, which is pretty surprising. And so some of the interviewers that I met was pointing that out as a cool thing about Google, because you don't have to worry about moving up. When you're moving up in your career, you don't have to worry about people management if you don't want to do it. But of course, you can decide to do it as well. But the point is that engineering as a stream goes, you can go up in the career path without actually moving out of engineering. So those are some of the cool things that I found out while working with Google. So now I'll get into talk about what I do, our division, which I mentioned, the NBU group. So the NBU group is focused on building products for the emerging markets. And so this is very interesting, because when you look at the next billion users who's going to come online, out of that, around 700 million of those are coming from mainly 3 countries: India, Indonesia, and Brazil. And if you look at regionally as well, Philippines has 100 million users coming online, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on. Which means that regionally we're in a really nice position where like 80% of the next billion users who's going to come online is in a 2-hour flight from where you are. So, which means that we have the regional understanding and the cultural aspects of it. Now, why Google is interested in the next billion users is basically because from a fundamental point of view, Google's mission is to make information organized and accessible universally. So when you say universally, it has to be accessible for everyone, which includes emerging markets. But if you look at it from a business point of view as well, if you look at Google or Facebook or any large organization, they focus on the next billion users because one important thing is, if you look at the developed market like United States or the Europe, over there's almost all the users are already online, and they're already using Google or Facebook, and they're already familiar with those technologies. And so there's not a lot of user growth remaining in those areas compared to like where the biggest user growth is going to happen in the emerging markets. So that's where the next people who are going to use these products is going to come from. So it's really important for those companies to actually address those markets. And it's not only those, but any organization that makes consumer products will have to worry about it, because as those emerging markets come into the internet, a larger portion of the user base becomes people from those emerging markets. And if you do not address those concerns that are very different from the developed markets, your products will not fare well in those markets. So, and the interesting thing is there's quite a lot of differences between the emerging markets and those developed markets, mainly due to technical barriers, financial barriers, as well as socio-cultural differences from those other markets. For instance, in those emerging markets, obviously there's very low internet connectivity. In fact, 60% of people will be living in 2G connections, not even 3G. And so, which means that you have to have your applications, whatever you're building, be compatible with very slow internet connections or spotty internet connections where the connectivity might go on and off every now and then. So what happens is people will be building their applications in a completely different environment where they have really good internet connectivity, and they'll be like testing the app, and they'll be like, well, our app works great, and it has fancy animations, it has beautiful images, but when it hits the user is in a completely different environment, and what happens is the user does not get that experience. It'll be seeing a very sloppy experience, because when you're developing it, you did not take into account those differences. And so in Google, what happens is we have some artificially made Wi-Fi connections which are poor in connectivity. So it mimics like 2G poor internet connectivity. So when we're building apps, we'll be testing it out in those Wi-Fi, so that we can get an idea about how a person in an emerging market would feel using our app. So another thing is, for instance, that's about testing your app in slow networks. The other thing is, before this, emerging markets, we didn't consider offline as we considered offline as an error state. But that's no longer true, because if you're treating offline as an error state, 90% of the time a user is using your app will be in an error state, which is not a good experience. So this is something Google also witnessed. So what happened was, so a lot of the Google products was modified to fit the emerging markets. For instance, there's YouTube Go, which is a new YouTube app that lets people download YouTube videos. So what happens is people would go to Wi-Fi hotspots or internet cafes and download the videos they're gonna watch during the day and play it over the day. And then if you look at Google Maps, we introduced Google Maps offline capabilities. So basically you can download the map and then go somewhere, and it'll be available for you. And so and it's not just Google. For instance, if you look at Flipkart, which is one of the biggest e-commerce platforms in India, so what they do is like so obviously to browse the products, you have to have the internet connectivity. But if you do not have internet connectivity, they still have the previously searched results cached in their client side, which makes it possible to. Okay, I'm getting a message saying I have a lot of questions. Sure, so I will address that in a few minutes. So, so basically, if you have, so what Flipkart did was they made their content available offline, the searched ones. So it makes for a seamless experience for the user. For instance, if you have a single step that requires online capability at the beginning of your app, but the rest can work without internet connectivity, because you ordered your flow in such a way that in the initial stage it requires internet connectivity, your app becomes useless for someone who does not have that connectivity at the time. So you have to think smarter about that on how you arrange the flows so that you don't get into this problem. Another thing is that data is extremely expensive in those markets. For instance, 95% of those people are using mobile prepaid plans, and data is up to 5 to 6 times more expensive in emerging markets compared to the developed areas. So basically what happens is users will be turning off the data multiple times a day, and they'll be switching between SIMs and devices to optimize for the data usage. So you have to be concerned, you have to really optimize for how much data you're using. For instance, do not animate, do not use fancy animations. You can animate with code, or you can avoid the high resolution images, or use a compression like WebP for image compressions. And this has shown successful results for various companies. For instance, UC Browser is a very famous browser which in India, and the reason why they have been so successful is because they're showing how much data they're saving for their users. And then if you look at the FB Lite, which only shows images when you tap on it, it uses basic fonts, simple graphics, so it's super simplified and extremely optimized for data. So when you're building an app for emerging markets, you have to be concerned about how well you're optimizing for data. And and the third thing is they use low-end devices, so think gingerbread, 4-inch screens. And what happens is you build your app for an iPhone 6s or a Samsung Galaxy 7, and you'll be assuming that the people will be getting the same experience. But in the reality is that people will be watching this in very tiny screens. For instance, if you have a huge sticker appearing it takes up a lot of screen estate. So you have to be concerned about things like that. Again, going back to the examples of FB, where they don't load images unless it's needed, and no animations on screen transitions, because those low-end devices do not have those capabilities to show those. And also focus on the size of the app, because if you look at the Line Mini, it's almost 34 times smaller than the Line normal app. The FB Lite is around 42 times smaller than the FB normal app, where you cut down on a lot of the unnecessary features and really focus on what's absolutely needed, and deliver a nice experience for those markets. And also, when we develop for NBUV, even the design concerns are taken into account. For instance, you'll be implementing slim lists, which means that your lists will be not populating a lot of information at the first go, but it'll be like tiny list items, so that A, it will not take a lot of data to load those information, and B, it will be easily visible in small screens. And another thing is the social cultural factors. For instance, how in a lot of the places it works is there will be technically savvy young people, and they'll be teaching others how to use those apps. So there's a lot of sharing of the devices. For instance, there's a famous chat application in India called Hike, and one of their successful points was that they allow hiding chats with a password, because because in India a lot of people will be sharing their devices with the family. So things like that can really make someone compete with giants like WhatsApp, for instance, which is what's happening in India right now. So it's really important that when you're developing for emerging markets, you do understand the differences of the market and cater to that. Cool. So let me get to the questions. Okay. Okay, so what are the advices you would give to a person who would like to get into Google or any other big tech company? So, so that's a good question. So that's a question that I get a lot. And so there's a few things that differentiates how the Google interview process works compared to other places. So as I said, so in Google, there's a lot of freedom, so which means that they want people to take initiative to do great work. So one thing they look into is like how much initiative have you taken in your career. For instance, if you're an undergraduate and the only things you have done is your coursework, then it does not really reflect. It does not give Google a good enough points to say that, okay, this person really has taken a lot of initiatives. But on the other hand, if you have contributed to open source code, or if you have contributed to, or if you have tried to build something on your own, that's a good indication that this person has seen problems and he has tried to solve these problems. And that's the kind of people Google would want in their teams, because that's exactly what Google does. So that's about the background of what Google would look into. But of course, Google looks into people who are capable of solving problems. And so if you look into the interview process, we don't ever. So I have been interviewed by 3 times. Altogether, I have had around 19 interviews with Google before I joined. So in none of those interviews was I ever asked any technical question. Like, what is how do you do with this exact thing in Java? Or have you used Spring, or how do you do this in Hibernate, or something like that. And the reason is because in Google, we don't use any of those, because in Google, the version control system is Google built, the build system is Google built, the server software is Google built, even the server hardware is Google built. And so it's a lot of customized things, and a lot of those technical knowledge about common frameworks would not really translate well as a helpful thing. And the second thing is, if you can solve problems, then that's what essentially matters. So when I say solving problems, there's few things that I need to point out. The first thing is we expect a person to be able to think in the Google scale. What it means is, let's say, let me illustrate this with an example. So let's say you're given the problem of, given a text, how do you find the frequency of each letter occurring in this text? So the obvious initial answer is that, okay, there's 26 characters, so we will create an array of 26, size 26, and then whenever we find a character A, we will update the 0th element in it. When we find B, we'll update the first element, and so on. So the problem with that is, so that's like the first initial approach, and which is fine. But at a Google interview, what we want is for people to understand the scale. So for instance, with that solution, you essentially forgot the existence of hundreds of different alphabets and thousands of languages which are using those alphabets. So that's a common thing about thinking in Google scale. So you cannot forget that there are so many other different types of languages and so on. So the second thing is, going back to the same question, so the obvious answer is you'll be running a loop through it and counting like that. But what if you could use multiple processors in the same machine? So then, of course, you could do things like you could break it apart, the whole text, and then give it to different threads, and then do the calculation parallelly. And then we would probably go into asking, like, okay, what if you had millions of text and you had thousands of machines at your hand to process this? Then how would you solve it? So obviously, then you can do things like a map reduce. So basically, you don't have to know what a map reduce is, but basically, the idea is like you can break the text into multiple pieces and give it to different machines, and each machine will parallelly count the number of occurrences, and it will feed into a reducer which will collect all those values and then create the aggregate values. But then, how would you solve if a machine goes down? Because when you have multiple machines, thousands of machines, obviously some of those machines are going to go down. So how do you handle those disruptions, those failure cases? And then how do you find out who would be the aggregator? Like, you'd be thinking of lead election algorithms and things like that. So as you can see, a very simple problem can be taken and thought of in a Google scale, where the problem will be about billions of people and hundreds of thousands of machines. So that's a very good example of how a Google interview might look like. But of course, the questions will be much harder than finding the frequencies of letters. Okay. So the technical skills that someone needs to have to enter Google, as I said, so we don't look into we don't ask any specific technological questions. However, we expect the people to be able to write code. How it typically works is the recruiter will be asking, like, what are the language you are most comfortable with, and you can say any language, and we will find an interviewer who is capable, who is familiar with the language, and but we expect the interviewee to answer and write working code using the language. But other than that, there's no specific frameworks or anything that we expect the people to know. ask the next question. So how did you land an interview with Google, and how did you prepare yourself to go interviews? So how it worked was there was an ex. He's now an ex-Googler. He's someone called Samarasekara, who's Professor Samarasekara's son. He came to our university and did a session and about Google and how it works. And so I forwarded my CV to him, and then he forwarded to him, forwarded the HR, and then they got in touch. But it really doesn't matter like what channel you'd be going into, as long as you've demonstrated enough initiative, like doing things like GSOP or whatever, that goes into showing that the entire motivation of coding for you is not just when you were asked to do it, as long as there's enough evidence of initiative. So that's another good question. Hope you wouldn't mind me asking what made you leave your startup and join Google, or is it being continued as a side hustle? So I left my startup and I joined Google full time. So the reason is because you have to look at the cost benefit of whatever decision you take, and so you have to look into, like, the way I think of it is like you have to look at your financial gain, you have to look at your professional gain, and you have to look at your social gain in whatever the decision that you're taking. And if so, you look at both the options that you have, and you evaluate that, and then you take the decision that makes more sense. And sometimes people assume that doing a startup is the only way to succeed. And the reason is because people will be looking at idolized characters like Ewan Spiegel or Mark Zuckerberg, and they will say like doing a startup is the only way to succeed, and which is not true. If you can do a great startup, that's great, but there are what a lot of people don't talk about is the long tail of doing a startup, and you have to look at the probability of success, and you have to make a decision for yourself as to, given those two paths, which one would be more profitable. And there's no one right answer for that, because, for instance, you have to do the math for yourself, and my math will not really fit anyone else's math, because it depends on what your startup is about, what your team is, whether the market is in the right place right now for the product that you're building, and if that is the case, then it would make sense to do the startup. If not, it would make sense to go in a different direction. And the good thing with joining a company like Google is that you get to impact a lot of people, and you can start building products that would impact millions of people. So that is something that was really interesting to me. If you fail the phone interview once, does it affect your future interviews? Do Google keep records of past interviews and candidate performance? If you fail the phone interview once, it does not matter. I failed the phone interview once as well. It can happen due to multiple reasons. I mean, you could have had a bad day, and Google understands this. And the rule is the rule of thumb is basically you can try again in 9 months to 1 year's time. I think Google does keep records of it, but it does not impact the new performance. So basically, how it works is when you go for the interview, there'll be like the online interviews, and after the online interviews, there's the on-site interviews. And at the on-site interviews, there'll be around 5 interviews, 4 of which is algorithmic, and 1 is a system design interview, typically. But the system design is basically you'll be asked. Imagine if you were asked to build Google search or some portion of Google infrastructure or some big system, how would you implement that? So, yeah, so what happens is then all of this interview feedback is presented to a hiring committee, and the hiring committee would be evaluating the fitness, and then it'll go into a compensation committee, which will decide the compensation, and then it'll go into executive review, which will finally give the offer, decide on whether to move forward or not. So it does not. So the previous ones does not have an impact. Winning competitions related to Google is MSc compulsory. Both of which is no. There are people of various backgrounds, some with double PhDs, some without a PhD, some without a master's, and I assume some would be without a bachelor's as well. I'm not sure about that though. But the thing is, again, it's not about those things. It's about whether you have made an initiative. So, for instance, there are a lot of people who have tried to do startups in Google. So the reason is because that shows that you have had a lot of initiative, and you saw a problem and then you tried to solve it, which is what exactly Google is looking for. As a person who works at the world's largest tech company, what would you advise be for startups in Sri Lanka? So I think there are a lot of good startups that is coming up in Sri Lanka. Some of my friends are doing great in startups in Sri Lanka. And I think Sri Lanka as a whole, and even Google is investing, some of the Google vice presidents like Rajan Anandan is investing in Sri Lankan tech startups. So it seems like a booming place right now. And given the context of emerging markets, for instance, there's a lot of opportunity regionally as well, because Sri Lankans understand the emerging markets, and so there's a lot of opportunity for Sri Lankan tech startup. And plus the other thing is there are companies who don't just focus on Sri Lankan market as well. A good example is, God, I forgot the name. There's this company that builds really great diagramming software, which is done by a Sri Lankan startup, and which is used globally as well. And there are people who are building apps that has like tens of millions of users in Europe and US that is being built in Sri Lanka. And that's a great thing, because if I saw the app, I wouldn't assume that it would have been Sri Lankans behind it. And that's the cool thing about technical in tech industry, because it doesn't matter where you are living in or what environment. And a good example is Israel, because Israel has a very strong startup culture, and it's becoming like a Silicon Valley of its own. And I have been using software, and I had no idea. I was thinking that it was built in US, and turns out it's not, and it was built in Israel. And it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, the people will be interacting with the app or the product, and everyone has a fair ground in this space. So why is Google not getting lots of engineers from Sri Lanka when compared to other South Asian countries in their conditions? So I don't think it's true, actually. There are a few so in India, as far as I know, there were 10 graduates who joined Google this year. So of all the graduates who graduated from India, I'm not 100% sure on the stat, but that's what I heard. So if you look at Sri Lanka, so there is considerable amount of Sri Lankans. I don't exactly know how much, but I definitely think that there's a lot of potential for more Sri Lankans to join Google. Yeah, it's just that I don't think people are applying enough. There should be more people applying. So how do you manage your health? I mean, software engineering goes hand in hand most of the time with junk food and sitting in a place for long hours. Would you share your experience regarding this and maybe your daily routine? So, um, so at Google, as a lot of people knows, we have very good working environment. Um, we have food everywhere. There's a rule that within 100 meters you should have food. So what we have is like we have micro kitchens everywhere, and spas and massages and all sorts of crazy benefits. Uh, but even without that, I think it's up to the people, like the engineers, to make sure that uh, you're comfortable with um, your work, because your work is definitely a massive part of your life. And if you think about, like, you'll be working 8 hours at least in a day, and if you're awake for like 16 hours, that's like 50% of the awake time you'll be doing your job. So uh, I've seen a lot of people saying like, this is my work life and this is my non-work life. And I think the whole concept of work-life balance is it should be thought of in a different way, because if what you're doing is basically what you like doing, if that is your hobby, then you're basically not working. And so it doesn't really stress you, it doesn't impact your health. And so I think if you don't like coding, don't do coding. That's the more important thing. Because in a lot of those, in a lot of countries, people would go into engineering just because they were asked to do engineering. But if you don't like doing it, then that's where problems like this happen, where you'll be stressed out and you'll be having a lot of issues, like with with work-life balance and so on. I heard that Google gives you 20% time for your own project. What is your 20% project in Google? So Google does not. So Google has a concept of 20%. We usually call it 120%, because what happens most of the time is people will be going over and above to do that 20%. And how the 20% works is you can set aside 20% of your time to do something outside of your assigned project, so your team. And it can be to learn some new technology, or it can be to contribute to a different project in Google. It can be a technical project, it can be a volunteering work as well. um, I don't have a 20% project right now, unfortunately, because I should get one, actually. Yeah, that's a good point. um, According to you, what is the best time to go with a startup? Just after graduation or after some industrial experiences? So that's a pretty broad question, and there's no one single answer to that. If There are a lot of successful entrepreneurs who just graduated and just started it, and then there's a lot of successful entrepreneurs who was in the industry and then they um, excelled in their startups. For instance, if you look, there's plenty of examples for those. But I think the point is that if you find the right product, if you get an idea for a great product, and if you see the market has the need, then that's what matters. And where you are in your life does not really count as to when you should become an entrepreneur. I hope that answers the question. What about internships in Google? Is there opportunities for Sri Lankans, and can we apply for internships? So, so Google has internships, and there have been many Sri Lankans who have applied to internships and who have successfully done internships. And so, how the Google recruitments work is, it's not specifically to a given single location. It's so when you go into the interview process, they will be asking you to what your preferred location is, and if there's fitting, like if there's enough vacancies available, they will be proceeding with the interview on that location. So it does not matter whether you're Sri Lankan or where you're from, and you can do your internship in any of the Google offices where there's a lot of engineering presence. Do you contribute to open source? What are the projects you're involved with? So I used to do GSOC. At that time I was working with Eclipse Foundation, and also I have done a couple of projects of my own for some of the. It was more like side projects that I was doing for fun, kind of, and yeah. So those are open source, but those are not with big organizations, but mostly my own personal projects. That is open source. First day at Google, it's pretty exciting, and so they have an orientation. They have an orientation which explains the nitty-gritties of working at Google, and they give you all the logistics like the laptop, and they would arrange your desktop environment. And one thing interesting is that we at Google we get to select how the exact environment is going to be for work. So you can select between a huge one screen or a medium-sized two screens, and you can select what sort of laptop you want, whether you want a MacBook or a Chrome or a Linux machine, and so on. So you get to choose those before you join Google, and then at the day you join, you get those, and then we'll be familiarizing ourselves with the environment. What careers are in Google that is not majorly coding? What are the ways to get into them? So at Google, so 60,000 roughly we have Googlers, and out of that 30,000 is engineers. So which means 30,000 are non-engineers. So there's sales, there's marketing, there's people operations, there's GTech, which is basically a bridge between sales and marketing and engineering, and then there's product management. So there's a lot of other things. It's not just engineering, definitely. What is the most interesting thing you did at Google? So I joined 1 year ago, almost 1 year ago, and so project. So unfortunately, I cannot talk about the project I am currently working in because it is not yet launched, and except for the fact that it's going to be focused on the next billion users. But so that project is obviously the most interesting thing I've done, but unfortunately, I can't speak about it yet. Um, how to be a better coder? That's a pretty broad question. I think a good source would be either you can start with getting involved with open source. That is the best way, I think, because that's something you can do irrespective of where you are in your career at the moment. There are a lot of organizations like Apache or Eclipse, and you can submit code to them and become a contributor. Or as the other way is you can get into websites like Topcoder, or there are many competitive programming sites, which helps you sort of, it's a different style of programming essentially. I wouldn't say that being good at one would necessarily mean that you'll become a good software engineer, or vice versa. If you're not good at that, it does not necessarily mean that you wouldn't be a good software engineer. But it's an interesting thing, and it definitely helps in making you focus on problem solving, and that's a really nice experience. Does Google use a specific software development process for projects? How do the projects kick off and planned? So there are various ways actually. Some of those from understanding the market needs, and some of those products would come as parts of acquisitions. And for instance, YouTube or Google Maps, those started as acquisitions. And some of those will be 20% projects that, so as I mentioned, so as part of the 20%, you can do your own thing as well. And if it gets enough interest with other people, a really good example is Google Now. If you guys, I hope you guys are familiar with Google Now, which suggests things to you based on your daily routine. So that was a 20% project idea. So there are various ways in which projects are started. And in terms of how the specific software development process works, it's pretty standard setup. You have your, talking in terms of how the code gets into the prod environments. So basically you be writing using a version controlling system, and then you be submitting the code. As I said, we're using a peer-reviewed process, and then it goes into so it goes into the build systems, and then the build system will be going into deployments, and then the deployments will happen in multiple servers. And so typically in Google, nothing works in a single machine. So it's always hundreds of machines which will have the same code running. So those deployments will happen on a kind of like a rollout mechanism. So the reason being, like, let's say for some reason your code is creating a lot of errors. So you wouldn't want to affect a bit like hundreds of millions of users at a single go. And so how that is done is basically it'll push the code into some servers, and it'll monitor like how much errors is happening in this particular server. And if there's massive amount of errors happening, then it'll create alerts, and then people can create a rollback and resolve those issues. So if not, it'll gradually go into the other servers as well. And that's how the software gets into the prod environments. Will there be a Google office in Sri Lanka anytime soon? I don't know. I saw an article where it was a Sri Lankan newspaper, but other than that, from Google's side, I haven't heard yet. Cool. Let me see. I've gotten a few messages as well. Right. Right. I think I have covered a lot of the questions. So if I haven't answered any of the questions, I will go through and try to answer in person or in the chat. I try to reply during the next few days. So please, if there's any more questions, just let me know, and I will answer them later. So if there's no more questions, we'll close it right now. So thanks a lot for SAF for inviting me for the event. I think SAF is doing a really great job in setting this up, and cool. Thanks a lot, guys.